What up, Cavs Nation? I'm your host, Ethan Sands, and I'm back with another episode of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. And this is the time we get to talk about our first conversation with DeAndre Hunter. He spoke to the media on Sunday afternoon. Jimmy, me, and Chris, who is not on today's podcast, we're all there. And Jimmy, I just want to get your overall perception of the player. He walked over. He was a stout 6'8", definitely clocked in, did his physicals. He will be available for Monday's contest against the Minnesota Timberwolves. But I just want to get your overall outlook on the conversation and just how he looked coming into camp.
I think the theme of today is that as much as we want to grade trades as soon as they happen and answer all these questions about DeAndre Hunter's fit before he plays a game, which if you think about it is kind of silly, but we want it. We want the answers now. It's going to take some time, right? Like, is DeAndre Hunter starting or coming off the bench? Is he going to play the 3 or the 4? The answer and the reason that the Cavs made this trade, those two things are one and the same, is kind of like, I don't know, we'll see. Like, the whole point of trading for DeAndre Hunter is because he can play the 3 and the 4. I mean, at 6'8", 225, he can probably credibly guard 2 through 4. I know Kobe said 1 through 5. I don't think he'd be their first choice on super quick guards. And as much we had Chris mention the fact that DeAndre guarded Victor Wembanyama during one of his last games in Atlanta. We had Kobe mention it, and then we had Kenny Atkinson mention it today. So clearly a lot of people with the Cavs watched that Spurs-Hawks game, saw DeAndre Hunter guard Victor Wembanyama, and said 1 through 5, 1 through 5. Again, I'm not so sure that DeAndre Hunter is going to be guarding, say, Joel Embiid in a playoff series. I think Victor Wembanyama is a very specific kind of center. Thinner, more perimeter oriented. DeAndre Hunter certainly has, I think what they're saying is he has the length, 7'3" wingspan to do that, which is nice. But at 225 pounds, not so sure about that. I feel really good about him playing the 2, the 3, or the 4. And when I say play, I mean defend. Your position is who you can guard in the NBA. He's a big wing. But the nice part is it doesn't really matter. Like, you can play him with a bunch of different combinations of other 2s, 3s, and 4s because he's so versatile defensively, because he shoots well. It doesn't really matter what you call him. And because he has both spent a lot of time starting in Atlanta before the season and entered the sixth man of the year race during this season, doesn't really matter if he starts or comes off the bench either. He said himself, I'm a player. Like, and I don't, whether I'm a 3 or a 4, it doesn't really matter. I'm here to win games. And Kenny said on the long end, it takes like 10 to 15 games to evaluate a player's fit, right? So everyone's going to watch tomorrow night, Hunter's first game, and make more sweeping generalizations about his fit with the Cavs. And that will also be wrong. The theme of today, as much as we all want more information about DeAndre Hunter, and we did get it, and we will talk about it, the grade on this trade, the big picture fit, all that stuff is kind of TBD.
I agree. I mean, it was funny. And obviously we have to do our jobs, right? We have to ask the questions, even though the answers are not going to be exactly what we want or necessarily available, because Kenny's still figuring him out. Like, today he said he went through some schematics things on the defensive end. They did some film work, and obviously he participated in practice, so they did those types of things. But it was more so getting to know the person rather than getting to know the player. And like, Kenny Atkinson kind of used the example of Max Strus coming back after missing 27 games and said, I needed like a certain and allotted amount of time for me to get to know him as the player. Oh, he likes pin downs. Oh, he likes DHOs. Oh, he likes these kinds of things. This is where we can use him. These are the lineups, especially 3, 4, 5-man lineups that work best with him in it. And Jimmy, when you talk about a guy like DeAndre who kind of fits in multiple different roles, like if you need a shooter, He's a shooter. You need a spacer. He's a spacer. You need a defender. He's a defender. And I think that's the most interesting part about whether he'll start, whether he'll come off the bench, whether he'll finish games, all these other questions that needed to be asked that didn't have the question or didn't have the answer from Kenny Atkinson. Like somebody asked literally after the buzzer had sounded, after the PR manager was like, hey, last question, that's it. And then somebody just chimed in after that saying, is he going to start? And Kenny was like, can I answer the question? And the answer was, we'll see. So I don't know if there's a better understanding or a better representation of even the Cavs don't really know yet how he's going to fit in. They don't know where he's going to exactly fit. Because especially when you talk about, and I like to use this comparison with him and Dean, because they kind of have the same archetype, same size build, and same value to this team. Obviously, DeAndre has been a better three-point shooter over his career, but I think you can make the argument that Dean Wade's still a better overall defender than DeAndre Hunter. So you put those two in comparisons, and it's like, okay, how are you going to mix and match them? And I think that's what helps Dean's case and just also Kenny Atkinson's lineup. But Jimmy, I want to get into the portion of this about DeAndre playing alongside some of these players. This was kind of what I was alluding to, is he said in his interview that he did not like playing against Evan Mobley and Jarrett Allen. He hated it. And now he's going to have a defensive mindset for this team when he locks into that. And it's because he has two rim protecting bigs behind him on any given occasion. Sometimes it will be one, and we'll get into that as well. But I want to get your thoughts on just him playing alongside those two bigs, and maybe even some of your favorite lineups that you're looking forward to seeing him play in.
Yeah, I think when DeAndre is saying I hated play against Jarrett Allen and Evan Mobley, it's because he knows how hard those dudes are to score over at the rim, right? And when you flip it, now he's on their team. So the way we've talked about Jarrett and Evan on the court together, or the value of them on the same team to this point, has mostly been you have protection for Donovan and Darius, who, as hard-nosed as they can be, as great an effort as they can give, are limited size-wise and do get beat off the dribble. But it's okay. It's easier. It's easier to stay in front of your man when you have the knowledge of, if I funnel him this way, there's an elite rim protector standing behind me. And two, you don't have to be so nervous is the wrong word, but like you don't have to worry about making mistakes as much when you have mistake erasers behind you. So when we take that same philosophy and apply it to DeAndre Hunter, well, DeAndre Hunter is a guy who's not at 6'8", 225, 7'3" wingspan, ain't too worried about letting anyone get past him in the first place, right? He has both the foot speed to keep up with guys, and if someone does get a step on him, he's long enough to where, like, cool, you got to step on me, you got to step past me. There's still half of my body that you need to get past because I'm huge, right? So when he has that confidence of knowing he has either Jarrett Allen or Evan Mobley, or in some cases both Jarrett Allen and Evan Mobley behind him, that allows him to be more aggressive on defense, right? He can take more risks. Kenny was talking about how the Cavs started out so well this season as a turnover forcing team and eventually tailed off. I think it's no coincidence that it's tailed off since, in part since Dean Wade and Isaac Okoro have been injured, two of their best perimeter defenders who might be thinking a little bit like DeAndre Hunter is in this instance. But now you have another guy who's super long and who's athletic enough to keep people in front of him. He can take a few more risks, poke at the ball, try to anticipate passes or anticipate passing lanes off the ball, because again, if someone gets behind him, he knows he's got help behind him, and that can turn the Cavs' stout, offensive stagnation-inducing defense into a weapon. It can turn it into a turnover-forcing defense. You can get these pick sixes now. You can rip guys. I think that is a huge part of the vision with this trade. In terms of, I mentioned this when we first did the trade podcast, I want to see DeAndre Hunter, Dean Wade, Evan Mobley, and Jarrett Allen on the court together, and I want them all to stand with their hands out horizontally as long as they can. And I just want whoever's dribbling the ball to see that maze of arms, 28 feet worth of arms. And by the way, that's 4 players. Pick whoever else you want to have on the court, probably Donovan or Darius, because you need an offensive initiator. But I just want to see what that looks like. I want to see Dean and DeAndre. Maybe you have to guard some smaller guys to see the viability of it in that sense. I want to see them space the floor, and I want to see Evan Mobley keep making threes so that, if that foursome is actually a viable offensive quartet, I'm not sure that it could be, but if it actually ever was, my goodness, what a weapon that could be for Kenny Atkinson in some instances. But I just want to see it. I want to see what it looks like when those four dudes have their arms out as spread as wide as they can. And I want to see other teams try to forget dribbling, try passing between some of those go-go gadget type of defenders, man. Like, that is going to be something. I'm sure Kenny will play that card. The rest of, as we've been saying for weeks now, because the Cavs started so well, the rest of the season can be in part like an experiment. Now that they have DeAndre Hunter, they're just going to be trying all kinds of combinations with him. I'm very intrigued to see if/when Kenny pulls that out, what it looks like.
That's a great point, Jimmy. You get me like thinking about multiple different things at the same time in this aspect, because like you talk about the defensive end, you talk about the zone that Kenny loves to run. Now you can have Dean Wade at the top.
The zone is a crucial point. Those guys just standing there, just using their arms, not even having to move very much. That is absolutely terrifying to think about for offenses.
Right. And then you also like think about Dean Wade and his foot speed at the top of that zone next to Donovan Mitchell, who also has some defensive prowess in him when he wants to lock in for real. And then you think about DeAndre, who like Isaac Okoro, Jarrett Allen, Evan Mobley. Like, and the other portion of this, Jimmy, is the Cavs have always had depth. They've had depth this entire season. But they've had to mix and match where they played players like Dean Wade playing 5 minutes, like Max Strus playing 4 minutes. That really doesn't have to happen anymore if they're entirely healthy. The depth chart goes at the point guard position, Darius Garland, Ty Jerome, Craig Porter Jr. Then you have the shooting guard position, Donovan Mitchell. And if you want to say this, Max Strus can finally play his natural position of shooting guard at 6'5", 6'4", or whatever you want to call him. He's the backup shooting guard. Then you have DeAndre Hunter as your potential starter. I don't think he's going to end up starting tomorrow, but I definitely think that's something that they're going to keep in mind. Then you have Isaac Okoro coming off the bench as a 3-man, right? Then you have the power forward position being Evan Mobley and Dean Wade. Jarrett Allen and Evan Mobley are the two centers as well. And if you really want to go all the way down, you have Tristan Thompson as your backup center. Backup center, right? So this is allowing the rotations to be more fluid for Kenny Atkinson and him not to have to continue throwing out lineups that we feel like we've never seen before. Not to say that he's not going to do that anymore, just he doesn't feel like he has to try something new. Like Karis LeVert won't have to be out of position. George Niang won't have to be out of position or a liability guarding Jason Tatum or Kristaps Porzingis in cases against the Boston Celtics last week, right? So I think these are the key pieces that are going to help the Cavs in the long run. And then you get into the switchability aspect of it, which we know this Cavs team has prided themselves on. And now they're just going to be longer, stronger, and have 3 to 4 defensive-minded players on the court at all times. That's insane.
The other thing that I think is really important when it comes to lineups here is that we talk so much about how important Dean Wade is and the defensive metrics that highlight him as one of the most impactful players in the NBA on that end. And I think for the most part, defensive metrics are about team more than they are about player, unless we're talking about rim protectors. And Dean Wade's individual, like his matchup data, a lot of things to suggest. I'm not saying taking anything away from Dean Wade, but I'm just saying it's more about the combination of Dean Wade plus elite rim protector. Those defensive numbers are more about that than it is about just Dean Wade's presence by himself. And so we always talk about one of the biggest strengths of having Evan Mobley and Jarrett Allen is that you always have at least one elite rim protector on the court at all times. Well, now the Cavs, I think DeAndre Hunter's defense is, if he plays up to his reputation and skill set the entire time he's here, and I expect him to do that more often, as we previously talked about on the last pod. I expect him to do that more often now that he's in a winning defensive culture. That's why I asked him a question along those lines today. So assuming that that is the case, now you have, if you want, and if Dean NP Wade is healthy, you have one of those guys, one of those great chess pieces, big wing, can space the floor as a stretch four, can guard the other team's, apex ball handling wing, 6'8" and above, or anywhere from 6'5" to 6'9", 6'10", those guys can both guard. You have one of Hunter and or Dean Wade always on the court alongside Evan Mobley and Jarrett Allen. Now your defenses. Now you've unlocked your favorite lineup. We've talked about how much Kenny loves Dean Wade and how Dean Wade needs to be a factor in the starting lineup. If DeAndre Hunter is even Dean Wade light on defense because he's Dean Wade plus on offense, that is a massive, massive matchup card to play for Kenny in the playoffs.
We continue to understand there is a viable connection to the team and the teammates and the players and the relationships that have already been built over just playing the game across their tenure in the NBA. Obviously, this is DeAndre Hunter's 6th year in the league, but Ty Jerome is the connector piece now. He is the glue piece. Everybody has been calling Georges Niang the glue for a lot of different time and a lot of different conversations. He has been the connector for Kenny Atkinson throughout the entire season. That role now falls to Ty Jerome. And it's not because Ty Jerome is the facilitator. He is the stabilizing force off the bench. All these other things. No. It's about connecting the chemistry that had been kind of ripped apart because Georges Niang and Caris LeVert were two crucial pieces of that. And sure, this is a business. Sure, this is something that they all knew was going to happen. But when it comes to losing two guys, that meant a whole lot. And they've talked about it as a grieving period. And there's two different separate types of emotions. You can be happy that you know that you improved. Darius Garland said that when they were in DC, they know they got better. But you also lost two very key pieces to the locker room. Georges Niang was also having a decent season. Caris LeVert, when he was healthy or not worried about getting traded, looked like he was having one of the better careers of his entire tenure in the NBA. And that portion has now fallen to Ty Jerome and how he is able to not only uplift DeAndre Hunter, but also show the team how he fits in and how he can fill in the gaps, and even how he can fill in the gaps off the court that were left by George and Caris. And maybe Darius Garland steps up as the funny guy or whatever, as George was. But all in all, Ty Jerome was a major piece in why the Cavs felt comfortable in making this decision. Not only because they have been looking at DeAndre Hunter since 2019 and he went one pick in front of them, not only because they played together in Virginia and won a championship, not only because they are, and there's an understanding between the two of what those two are capable on the court together. I mean, Jimmy, that's a backcourt bench unit that you could use all the time, and they already have plays that you can run. And we've talked about this. Kenny Atkinson goes back and loves watching Virginia basketball, so he could just implement sets that they had back when they were in college. And that's just that's how you are able to continue to add players into a lineup and make the team seamlessly flow again without having to wait too long. Even though Max Strus, when he came back, it took Kenny Atkinson, he said, about 20 games to really feel his way. Now he's saying 10 to 15. There might be a reason that the period might be a little bit shorter. Or he was being facetious and trying to be nice about it, and it might take him a little bit longer.
The Ty Jerome point is so, so crucial, and it goes beyond the chemistry element with DeAndre. Though, I mean, it's not nothing that they played together at Virginia and won a national championship. I would be remiss if I was on this pod with a fellow Bobcat and then didn't point out that the next time Virginia played in the NCAA tournament, they lost in the first round to our Ohio Bobcats. Jason Preston, you're a legend forever. That being said, this is not just Ty Jerome, DeAndre Hunter chemistry. This is a massive bet that what Ty Jerome is showing you is real. Not only real in the regular season, but sustainable in the playoffs, which is a much different question than is it sustainable in the regular season, right? To this point in the season, Ty Jerome's contributions, which have been great, but they've been icing on the cake, right? The Cavs machine has been humming on so many other different levels, including, like you said, Karis LeVert having one of the best seasons of his career until like the last month or so. That's like, wow, we have this guy who was supposed to be maybe our 12th man, but he's a viable bench creator and giving us, I think he's got 7 20-point games this year or something like that. Like, that's awesome. Cherry on top. Thank you, Ty Jerome. Now Ty Jerome is an essential piece of this. He's like, okay, so we got Donovan, Darius, Evan Mobley, I think eventually DeAndre Hunter, your top 4 creators. But I would put Ty Jerome right up there next to DeAndre Hunter in terms of like a guy who's going to have the ball in his hands a lot and who's going to initiate a lot of offense. Like Ty Jerome just became like an essential piece of this thing. No longer the icing on the cake. He's like the dough that you're making the cake out of. Like, you need him. You need him in the playoffs. We're talking, third guard for sure. We're talking secondary creator, because in the playoffs he'll never play without one of Donovan or Darius. He rarely does that now. But like, that's you're betting on this guy who has, and I'm not saying I'm doubting Ty Jerome here. I'm just telling you the facts. This guy has, other than his he had a brief stint of this with the Thunder in 2021. Other than that, he's never even really approached what he's done this season in the NBA. 11.3 points per game is a career high. The 3.4 assists per game, that's the second highest of his career. The effective field goal percentage is almost 4 percentage points higher than it has ever been at this point, at any point in his career over a full season. So again, we're not just saying, this goes way beyond Kenny saying a couple weeks ago, I think this is real. Like, I'm ready to say that Ty Jerome is just a really good rotation NBA player. I agree with you. I also think he's a really good rotation NBA player. He's proven that already. But proving yourself in the playoffs is a completely different animal, particularly as can Ty Jerome, let's say Ty Jerome keeps up what he's doing on offense. Let's say the floater game remains as smooth as it is, and he can still use his size against guards to get in the lane and shoot over them. The 3-point shot remains locked down. The defense, Ty Jerome, Karis LeVert had a little bit more length and quickness than Ty Jerome has. And I do think it's just not saying, I think Ty Jerome, because you played at Virginia, you have to play some defense. And I think because of his positional size gets overlooked a little bit in this conversation. But I'm just saying, because he's a newer guy, teams are going to go after him just to see, like, what do we got here? Like, can this guy survive in a playoff setting? Anytime you see a new guy who's not like a lockdown defender by reputation get real minutes in a playoff series, other teams are going to see what they have there. The Celtics are going to, try to get Ty Jerome in a switch against Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum. They're going to hunt him a little bit, and it'll be interesting to see what happens. Now, when you have Evan Mobley, Jarrett Allen, DeAndre Hunter, Dean Wade around him, probably 2 at least of those 4 at all times on the court, that's going to help you out. I'm just saying, this is a massive, massive bet by the Cavs on Ty Jerome.
It's also on a guy that's on an expiring contract, Jimmy. So what does that mean for him coming into the offseason? And the other portion of that, Jimmy, this is the most games he's played in a season in his entire career. 49 games. He's already played the most games in his entire NBA career in one season. And this is coming off a year when he played 2, right? This is coming off a year where he had ankle surgery. Like, the amount, and you got to give credit when credit is due. You being able to have a bounce back season like this and showcasing that you are one of the most important facilitators, ball handlers, all these other things for a team that is already on the cusp of Eastern Conference semifinal, finals, or bust. That's what we've been calling it, right? But you're absolutely right about the defensive end. When it comes to Ty Jerome being at the point of attack, we know he has great hands. Great hands. He is able to pickpocket. He's able to get his hand into space. But and that's why we see a lot of the time when he is playing defense, he's got his hands out or he's body to body with somebody. Because if he's not, They're going to be able to use his slow hips because he doesn't have great hip mobility, ankle mobility when it comes to being able to turn his body into space and get back in front of his offensive player. He's a guy that if they switch his hips a little bit, they get by and they get into the lane. That's been the one biggest flaw of Ty Jerome's defensive game. He's a great pesky guy. He's going to get at you. He's going to be, and that's why we talked about this. Kenny Atkinson likes guys that are going to be aggressive at the point of attack because they can rely on the guys behind him. But in Ty Jerome's case, it's hurt him at points because he's been over-reliant on the help defense, over-reliant on the guys behind him. And sometimes that's been beneficial because you still have Evan Mobley and Jarrett Allen behind you to clean up your mess. But a lot of different times against these bigger offensive players, 6'8", Jason Tatum, 6'6", 6'5", Jaylen Brown, whoever you want to compare it, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, like guys with handle, guys that can drive, guys that use their body to get into you. That's the players that he's struggled to defend. So I think having DeAndre on the floor with him, having these guys around him has helped, but I still want to see a better approach from Ty Jerome on that aspect of the defensive end. And this is the other point, and you mentioned it, Jimmy. He does not have playoff experience. Like, you go to his basketball reference page and you usually see like a drop-down menu for regular season versus playoff. There's no option for that. He doesn't have any playoff experience, right? And that's not a knock on him. It's a knock on the health that he hasn't had. The most games that he's played in the season entering this year was in his third year in the NBA. He played 48 games, right? And this is an understanding that will his body continue to hold up? Will his body still be able to go through this? Like, what fatigue level are you going to have in a season where you're going to have to play 82 games plus? Because you want to win 16 games in the playoffs. So I'm trying to figure out, and I want to see how the drive, the understanding, the focus is when it comes to being tired. And that's one of my favorite stories that we've had this year was about Donovan Mitchell saying he had to defeat fatigue. And that is one of the hardest battles any athlete has to endure.
Looking at Ty Jerome's game logs, his one, he doesn't have his, I'm thinking that his like 10 highest minute totals. So from like 24 minutes, November 27th against the Hawks to 33 minutes against Philly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of those 10 minute totals have come in the last month or so. And that's just to show you, like, it's not just what Ty Jerome was giving you before. It's they're relying on him to give them even more now that Karras is going to be gone permanently. They're asking him to not just handle the ball more, not to, hold up on the defensive end more often. They're just asking him to give more of his body, to expend more energy, to put more strain on a body that, again, we just haven't seen it yet. I'm not saying clearly the Cavs feel very, very confident that Ty Jerome, and this has been a part of what they've been praising him about the entire season, has figured out the physical fitness part of this, has gotten his body up to speed with the rigors of the NBA, and that he's ready for the workload they're asking him to do. I just want to reiterate, this is about as large of a bet as any team has ever placed on a dude that started the season out of their rotation.
I think that's a great point, Jimmy. And I want to get back to DeAndre just because there's obviously it puts a lot of stress and pressure, but pressure is a privilege in the NBA. It means you're doing something right. And I think that's important. But it's also the fact that Kenny Atkinson mentioned today, they can also rely more on Craig Porter Jr. And obviously there's a little bit of recency bias in that. But Craig
Porter Jr. is not playing playoff minutes. He's just not.
Right.
Craig Porter Jr. can help shepherd you through the regular season. He can help give Ty Jerome a break when Ty Jerome needs a break. That's true. He's a nice backstop to have behind Ty Jerome. But like, as much as I think Craig has real potential to be a backup point guard in this league, he's just not ready for playoff minutes yet. So this is a Ty Jerome bet first and foremost.
100%. And this is more a conversation just getting to the playoffs. Like the being able to give Ty Jerome a break, giving Darius and Ty Jerome a break. Then you could be able to bet on Craig Porter Jr. in his second season. And like, this is something that we've talked about before. We talked about it a lot last year because he played so many more minutes last year than he was supposed to. Like, and I said this at the beginning of the season, with Ty Jerome healthy, this has been more of a rookie year for Craig Porter Jr. than it was last year. Because he went down to the two-way, he was on a two-way, he was down there for like a minute, got bumped up to an NBA standard contract, and was there for the rest of the year as the backup point guard and sometimes the starting point guard because Darius Garland was hurt. So I think what you've been able to see from Craig in minimal minutes is just a testament to his calm presence, his ability, and that's what we've talked about when they got him as an undrafted free agent after he was not picked in the latest draft. Like, the fact that he had so much college experience has helped him tenfold, because you've seen it with Jalen Tyson a little bit. Like, he's had to kind of find his rhythm, find out who he is. Craig Porter Jr. came in and knew who he was, exactly who he was, knew what spots he needed to get to, knew what pace to play at. Jalen Tyson, the rookie this year, is still figuring that out. And not a slight to Jalen, because we've also seen what Jalen has done over the last couple of games, his energy, his offensive rebounding, his rebounding in general that we've talked about so much that it's translated over. I just think these players that are at the end of the bench are going to have a bigger role as the season progresses before the playoffs. And then they'll have to have this harsh reality of, you're not going to play in the playoffs. The depth chart is going to hit what we talked about earlier. Is going to be 9-10 guys max, and that's how it's going to be. And I think the understanding and the thought process for them is the biggest portion of how they can impact and learn in the minutes, in the time that they have left of this season.
I think that's kind of the natural order of things, right? Like, I don't think Jalen Tyson came into, he could have goals of trying to crack the playoff rotation when he got drafted 20th overall. But like, I think realistically, he understood, like, if I crack the rotation during the season, that's great. But the playoffs are when everything gets shrunk. You look at you just count bodies in front of him. Like, it's going to be hard for him to jump some of these guys. Another part, lesser discussed part of this trade is that Kobe kind of unlocked the minutes jam that could have existed for Kenny at the end of the regular season. And we can talk about how Karis and George were valued members of the locker room, both for how they kept it light or how they held people accountable. They helped build the culture. Those are all valid points. I'm not trying to belittle any of that. But I do think there were some really hard decisions on the horizon, particularly as it pertains to a George Niang, let's say. Like we saw last year where, George was a great culture guy and then was pretty unhappy throughout the playoffs, right? And has, since JB Bickerstaff has been gone, I would say passive aggressively made mention of what he likes about what Kenny does versus how other coaches sometimes are. The comment at the beginning of the season, we've mentioned this 1,000 times about how it doesn't feel like every time he shoots a jumper, he's shooting for the ability to keep playing anymore, right? Like, I think that is a direct shot at JB without saying his name. So like that stuff can get weird really quick with veterans who expect to be in the rotation and then find themselves on the outside looking in. With the younger players, I think it's twofold. One, you see, we were talking about it, Ethan, like Jalen Tyson's doing some stuff out there. Like the play against Washington where he grabs the rebound and throws it back in with the and one, like that's the exact kind of stuff you want him to be like a junkyard dog out there. And that's a huge adjustment to him, to your point. Like Craig, your point that you made about Jalen's adjustment and how different it is to Craig's is really good, because Craig was in college kind of a table setter, a defense prober, and when he plays for the Cavs, they're shorthanded, so they kind of need him to be a table setter and a defense prober. Jalen Tyson, Cal was like, here's the ball, do stuff with it. And the Cavs are like, now with the Cavs, it's like, you're only getting the ball if you're open for a corner three, cutting for a layup, or you get a rebound. And by the way, if you get that rebound, you better pass me the frickin' ball immediately. is that's a huge adjustment for him, but he's doing it well. So now you get more with it's not even like, okay, the addition of DeAndre Hunter we talked about, the subtraction of George and Karras, as much as the Cavs do appreciate everything they did, it frees up a little bit of this blank canvas for your end of bench guys that you want to see more of, like a Jalen Tyson, where it's just like, we think you're doing some pretty interesting things here, and we want to see potentially what you could do if we give you more opportunities to do that. Right now, of course, a lot of the George Niang minutes are going to get eaten up by DeAndre Hunter and Dean Wade when he comes back, right? But in the interim, there will be more. Even when Dean Wade was hurt, you still have this George Niang equation to deal with. Now you have less of that. Now, in the moments where it makes sense to play Jalen Tyson, you can play Jalen Tyson like full bore and see what else he can give you. And then at the end of that, you don't have to have a really awkward conversation about how we sold you George Niang on a certain role when we signed you in free agency, and now we're going to walk back on that because the environment has changed around us. We have guys who have played their way ahead of you in the rotation. And frankly, you're not giving us what we thought you would give us as often as we would like. It's just Jalen Tyson, you're a young guy. You did great for us during the season, but you're not here yet. You're not ready for this level of basketball. And that's a much more digestible explanation to give a young player. And I think that just is easier for Kenny to manage, frankly.
George even kind of talked about what you just mentioned in his introductory press conference when he was in Atlanta. He was like, we feel like, me and Karras feel like we deserve minutes, right? We deserve, we've been here, we've been hustling, we've been grinding, we've been just doing the same amount, and you came and got us because you wanted playoff experience, you wanted veteran leadership, you wanted all these things. And like every time I would ask, because I feel like it fell on my shoulders after games where Jalen Tyson didn't play, and I'm asking Kenny, and I'm like, so why didn't you go to Jalen Tyson? And he said, we thought about it, but we have to rely on guys who have been there before. Okay, isn't it in the regular season where you want to give guys the opportunity to learn how to deal with situations that they haven't been in before? Like, anyway, just to get to the last portion of this conversation, Jimmy, like, one of the biggest things that you mentioned was how this also helps them in the future, right? Now, Jimmy, everybody on this roster, except for Tristan Thompson, who does not play, basically, is under 30 years old. Everybody on this roster, the oldest player on this roster, is between Dean Wade, Max Strus, and Donovan Mitchell, and Sam Merrill. Like, all four of those guys are 28 years old. They're in their prime. Like, you have a runway as long as you would like it to be based on contract situation, salary cap, luxury tax, first apron, all these other things. Like, if you want to bring Ty Jerome back, when these repeater taxes start hitting next year, when all of the maximum contracts come to fruition, those are conversations that you're going to have internally. And Dan Gilbert, as Chris would want me to say, is not afraid of spending money if it ends up helping them in the long run. And I'm saying this to say, if the Cavs end up going to the NBA Finals, do not be surprised, especially if they win. Do not be surprised if Dan Gilbert is like, well, I really like this team, and I feel like we can create a dynasty. Here's some money. We're going to go into the first apron. We don't have any draft capital, so it doesn't really matter about us not being able to utilize that as much. So we can wait till 2031, basically 6 years. That means Donovan Mitchell will be 34 years old. Like, come on. This is the again, we continue to say we have these hard conversations, and the organization has these hard conversations. When it comes to money, that's seemingly the next one, because you figured out the roster, you figured out the minutes, you figured out the rotation, you figured out all the things that everybody can see on the surface level. Now it becomes deeper. How are you going to pay these guys? How are you going to get these maximum contracts out? When are these contracts ending? Who are you going to re-sign? Who are you going to extend? Are you bringing back Tristan Thompson next year? All these things. So, Jimmy, when it comes to the hard questions, when it comes to rotations, when it comes to all these other things, how do you feel like the Cavs should handle it, and what the baseline should be when they go into it? Like, how do they decide what moves to make going forward?
Well, they don't have many options. That's the flip side of this. It's good that you have basically a rotation's worth of players locked in. I mean, the idea of trading Karis LeVert on an expiring contract, who just by nature of the salary environment that we are in was probably due for a pay raise, for DeAndre Hunter, who's on a contract that runs through 2027 at about $22.5 million per year for one of the most valuable positions in the entire sport. Sure, Karis LeVert and George Niang, but like if we're talking like DeAndre Hunter is going to play closer to Karis LeVert minutes than he's going to play George Niang minutes. That's why I'm speaking of it that way. George Niang and the second round picks and pick swaps are like the sweetener, I guess. Like that trade alone, in terms of longevity, makes a ton of sense to me. And in terms of positional size, makes a ton of sense to me. The trick is if it doesn't work. And I think this trade definitely increased the Cavs championship probability. By how much? Where was it before? That's a harder thing for us to chew on right now, but it definitely increased it. The trick is if it doesn't work, if the Cavs decide after this playoff run or next playoff run that they need to make a change, is going to be a big one. We're talking about, because you're going to have, I mean, Darius, Donovan, and Evan alone are going to take up a huge hunk. I don't have the math directly in front of me. I was frantically typing Spotrac into my web browser while Ethan was talking. I didn't quite get to the page I wanted to. But we're talking a huge percentage of your team's available spending money is going to be spent on three guys. Plus Jarrett Allen's making $30 million a year. That's nothing to sneeze at. DeAndre Hunter's 22.5. That's nice value right now. But if you like him, you might want to extend him between now and then. And that's going to be, if you like him, that means he's playing well. And a guy who's has his measurables and fits the role that he does, who's playing well, is very expensive in this league. So I hope the Cavs do end up liking this team, because this is probably going to be their team for the next 2 or 3 years. And particularly and we're getting way far ahead of ourselves right here. But if it doesn't work and we start to have the conversation about what does it take to retain Donovan again on the 10-year max, right? The moves like this one, the Karis LeVert, George Niang for DeAndre Hunter type moves, are less available to you now, because your money is, you're going to be over the cap. The longer you're over the cap and into the they will eventually be in the first apron. It was a great move to get under it this year, but they are going to get into that first apron, and it's going to be a factor to try and avoid some of the more punitive cap penalties that come with staying over into the second apron for multiple years. Just your flexibility is limited. These things where, down the road you might not be able to use your mid-level exception, or you have to use you can't aggregate salaries and trades, or when you're over the cap, you basically have to match money exactly regardless of what apron you're sitting under. Like, these are harder trades to make. So if this iteration of the Cavs doesn't work, now we're going to have to talk about losing a significant piece of the team, whether that's in the core four, or if we want to throw Hunter's name in there. Like, this is a push all in. Kobe Altman said I think, was it Kobe who said all in on the presser last week?
Yep.
It really is. It really is. This is the team now. And if it doesn't work, you're going to have to lose a big part of what you've built here. So as much as it does, it's smart to play this game, 2-3 years ahead and lock DeAndre in and it's great because it's a good team to have all the security that you have on this roster. The flip side of that is, if it doesn't work, and we're not saying it won't, but if it doesn't work, your flexibility options are severely, severely limited. So I just want to reiterate, as much of a bet as this is on Ty Jerome, as much of a bet as this is on DeAndre Hunter, this is a massive bet on the Cavs saying, hey, we've found it. We've found the championship formula here. And so we're locking it in for a couple of years here, because we think we have a real championship window here to push all of our chips to the center of the table.
Yep. And that's the window that you mentioned, that runway that we say is super, super long. It's about 2 years long, or in this case, 2.5 years, right? That is what we're looking at. We are looking at, and as Jimmy said, we're getting way, way ahead of ourselves at this point. But that 2027 trade deadline, that's looking a little interesting. We got the goggles out trying to look into the future. Got a crystal ball trying to see what happens. But that all becomes dependent on what happens this year and how the Cavs are able to showcase themselves in the playoffs with guys who have playoff experience, with guys who don't, and with guys who want to showcase that they can get past the Eastern Conference semifinals, because the only players to do that on this team, Max Strus, Tristan Thompson. That's the goal. Eastern Conference finals or bust. And that is not a slight anymore. It is or bust. Because if you don't get to that stage, then you have to reconsider and rethink about things a little bit sooner than you even might have wanted to. But with all that being said, that'll wrap up today's episode of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. But remember to become a Cavs Insider and interact with Chris, me, and Jimmy by subscribing to Subtext. This is where you can send in your questions about the DeAndre Hunter trade or anything you want to ask for the Hey Chris episode that's coming up this week. To do all of this, sign up for a 14-day free trial or visit cleveland.com/Cavs and click on the blue bar at the top of the page. If you don't like it, that's fine. All you have to do is text the word STOP. It's easy, but we can tell you that the people who sign up stick around, because this is the best way to get insider coverage on the Cavs from me, Chris, and Jimmy. This isn't just our podcast, it's your podcast. And the only way to have your voice heard is through Subtext. Y'all be safe. We out.